And welcome to the last CLM webinar of 2025. Our topic today is From Test Results to Field Application, Practical Manure Management Strategies. And we will have 3 guest speakers for you all today. But first, let's mention a few upcoming events. We have our annual Water Quality Wednesdays webinar series coming up January 28th, February 25th, and March 25th. You can register for that at go.osu.edu/WQW26. And our next CLM webinar in this series is going to be on February 2nd at 10 a.m. I don't believe we have a topic for that yet, so more information is to come. This is also a new series, so we have a new Go link for that. You'll need to re-register for the entire series in order to get those Zoom links. So as always, today's webinar is brought to you by the OSU Extension Water Quality Team. Here you can see the map that our team currently covers. My name is Rachel Henry. I am the Water Quality Associate for Paulding, Defiance, and Van Wert counties. And our co-moderator today is Amber Emmons. She covers Henry Wood and Ottawa counties. Our website is waterqualityextension.osu.edu. And our speakers for today's webinar, we have first up Amanda Douridas. She is the Extension Educator in Madison County. Next, we will have Kendall Lovejoy. He is the Extension Educator in Fulton County. And wrapping up today's webinar, we will have Eric Rieker. He is a Field Specialist for Farm Management, also with Ohio State University. So with that, I will stop sharing and I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Good morning, everyone. Excited to be here with you today. I used to work with Manure quite a bit as a program coordinator in the Ag Engineering Department and taught up at ATI for a few years in Madison County currently, and excited to get to talk about manure here today again. So really, my objectives are to talk about calculating manure nutrients, interpreting manure tests, kind of looking at some of those manure characteristics so we can then generate a manure application recommendation that helps us meet our yield goals as well as protect the environment. So I'm sure many of you are experienced manure applicators. You're familiar with the different types of manure consistencies, or at least familiar with the ones that you deal with day to day. And I just want to reiterate that that can really play a major role in nutrient content. So some of the systems can dilute nutrients if you're adding water to that system. Organic sources like bedding can also impact that nutrient content. Storage systems, whether it's liquid or solid, can either help conserve or lose nutrients to the environment over time. So think about your system, the systems on your farm or that you work with, and how that handling may impact nutrient content. So as you're going through that thought process, as you're working with that manure day to day, you might find there are some ways that you can tweak that system to conserve nutrients and make application more efficient as well. So these are all the things that maybe we don't think about every day that go into that manure storage and application and really impacting the nutrients on the farm. So of course, if you have an organic bedding source, if there's feed that's getting into that manure, rain is a big one. We always like to say, keep clean water clean. So thinking about runoff and where that's going, if you can exclude that from your manure storage area, that's less water that you have to deal with and haul within your manure application plan. So let's move into actually talking about manure management from a nutrient standpoint. So sampling manure is one of the critical steps in determining how much manure you're going to put down. Obviously, you can't decide how much you want to put down based on nutrients if you don't know what's in your manure. So first off, determining that reputable lab, asking about their sampling protocol if you've not used them before. So how do they want that manure? It differs, of course, whether it's solid or liquid. The amount that they need is really important. Some may need a gallon bag, some may need a pint jar of liquid. So ask them about that. And then make sure that you accurately label those samples so you know what they are when you get them back. I am guilty of this in my on-farm research. I think I'm going to remember something, and then a month or two later, when I'm actually looking at it, I can't make heads or tails. So make sure you take good notes. Was it sampled at a certain storage? Was it sampled at the beginning, middle, or end of the application? So those are some things to take note of. And then it's really important to take or ship those samples as soon as possible, but not at the end of the week. And the reason I say that is that nitrogen content, of course, is not stable. So you don't want them sitting in a warehouse or, on the doorstep over the weekend, especially if it's hot out. If you can't get them to the lab right away, then you can freeze them and send them in when you have time. So just some reminders about sampling, when to sample. That one's a tough one with manure if you haven't sampled before, because you want to get a good robust sample when you think about liquid manure or solid manure. Depending on how that's gone into the storage, of course, liquid, it needs to be agitated really well to get a good idea of what those nutrient contents are. However, you don't want to agitate if you've got a barn full of livestock or just to pull a sample, right? So, agitating as best you can in a small area, making sure that if you're going to do a pre-sample, that you're mixing up some of those solids along with the liquid content. With your solid application, just pulling grab samples from that storage. And then when you apply, that gives you the opportunity to really take some robust samples at the beginning, middle, and end, because nutrient content can change throughout that. And for solid, that can be using tarps spread out in the field, liquid, just taking some samples as you're filling the tanker every so often. And then there's a really good series that I think it is Iowa Learning Farms put out, and I'll put that in the chat. They have some YouTube videos on how to sample different areas of different types of manure, from a feedlot to liquid storage, under a hog barn, those types of things. So if you're looking for recommendations on how to do that, check out that YouTube series. Okay, here's an example of a manure analysis. This is liquid manure. So of course we have our moisture content. That's pretty typical in a manure analysis. Then we've got our total nitrogen, ammonium organic, phosphorus and potassium in their plant available forms. So it's really critical that you get these nitrogen portions broken out, ammonium and organic, and I'll go into detail further there. So you can see liquid manure, so pounds per 1,000 gallons. And then the lab does some estimates on what's available in the coming years. And the first year, sometimes they do second and third years, as we'll see in the next one. It's important to understand what they're basing those calculations on. That may differ than what we want to do here in Ohio or what you want to do on your farm. So if you're going to use these recommendations, make sure you understand where they're coming from. Give the lab a call and they can tell you what sources they used, or it may be on the bottom of the report as well. This is another one. This is solid dairy manure. This is reported on an as-is basis, pounds per ton, so we can see our total nutrients. This one you see total nitrogen, it's not broken down. So by ammonium and organic, and we really need to have that in there again. So make sure when you send your sample to the lab that you check the box that you want them broken down. It might cost a little bit more money, but it's really crucial if you want to have a good idea of how much nitrogen you're putting out there. So this is why I've been talking about those nitrogen components. We have ammonium and organic within that total nitrogen. And organic is pretty straightforward. There's a portion of that that's not going to be available right away just because it's tied to organic material. So we say about a third of that is going to be available if you're applying it, before June to that growing crop. And it's fairly stable. Ammonium, however, can vary widely, and that's because it's not tied to that organic material. It's not a stable nutrient, just like our commercial nitrogen products. We can lose those over the winter, or as we see here in April through June, if it's a hot sunny day. So we have our dates here and we have our days to incorporation. So if we look at this April to June, less than 1 day, 75% of it will be available. So if we're able to incorporate that, we can conserve most of that ammonium portion. However, if we look at more than a day, if we're leaving that on the surface, even for just a couple days, because it could be hot and sunny, that could volatilize and we'll lose a lot of that nitrogen. So then we can only count on about a quarter of it, which for some of our manures, we're trying to balance that NPK, and we really need as much of that nitrogen as we can. So this is the latest information we have. This is Bulletin 604. I haven't seen research updates specifically for the amount of nitrogen that's available. You may have different experiences on your farm. You may see that you can conserve most of that ammonium, which if you have experience with that in your application methods, that's fine. But for purposes, university-based research, this is what we recommend using. So when we think about developing our nutrient management plan and working on those calculations, we really need to pull that all together with a manure sample, a soil sample, which we don't have time to talk about today, but plenty of information out there on that, and then determining what our crop needs are. And that is how we come up with a successful nutrient management plan. So again, what do we need to know? Well, make sure you're looking at what that manure is reported in, pounds per 1,000 gallons or pounds per ton. What are you going to base your application rate on? So which nutrient, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium? When will it be applied? So we know how much nitrogen we can count on, and how will it be applied for that same reason. So I want to work through a couple of examples here. And if you have a pen and paper handy, you can do this along with me. So let me pull up. Okay. So I just have this in a Word document so we can kind of fill in some of this. I've got 3 examples here, but I doubt we'll get to them. We'll see how this goes. All right, so for our first example, we have corn, 200 bushels per acre is our yield goal. That's just based on typically your 5-year average for that field. And we want to base our application rate on P205. Okay, so what's our unit of measurement for this manure test? We can see our test results down here in the bottom section. So can anyone tell me what that's reported in? Just type it in the chat. Okay, pounds per 1,000 gallons. So we're dealing with liquid manure here. So pounds per 1,000 gallons, and we're basing it on P2O5, which would be which nutrient we're applying. When are we going to apply? Well, we're going to apply on May 1. You can see that up here in this area, and then how it's going to be applied is surface application. Okay, so to start off, we need to know how much do we need to apply of P2O5 to reach that 200 bushel goal. And that's where our tri-states come in. So I've got it over here on the side. We can see our corn phosphorus recommendations. So 200 bushels is our yield goal. We see our soil test results right here. So phosphorus, we've got 15 parts per million, Malic 3. So we go over here, we see 15 and 200. So we need 95 pounds of P2O5 per acre. All right. Oops. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we determined we need 95 pounds of P2O5. So I'm just typing these down here in the bottom as we go so you can kind of see. So if we need 95 pounds, then we go to our manure test and we see we have 26 pounds per 1,000 gallons available in our manure. So our next step then is to divide that out. So we have 95 divided by 26, so 3.65. Now, because we're dealing with pounds per 1,000 gallons, we do need to multiply that by 1,000. So we take that 3.65 times 1,000, and that gives us 3,650 gallons per acre is going to be our application rate to get that 95 pounds of P2O5. So the next thing we need to figure out is how much nitrogen we have if done on May 1 surface application. So again, we have to go back to that chart. Pull that up here. So we're applying in May, so we're in that April, June surface application, so greater than a day, April, June. So we're in that 25% for ammonium and 33% for organic N. Okay. So to calculate that, we'll have to multiply that out for our nitrogen and organic. So we've got ammonium, nitrogen, 20 pounds per 1,000 gallons and 5.3 pounds for organic N. Let me bring those calculations in. So we have 20 times 0.25, and that equals 5 pounds of ammonium per 1,000 gallons, right? And then we have 5.3 pounds per 1,000 gallons of organic N, and we multiply that by a third, so we have 1.75 pounds. And that we add those together to give us our total nitrogen of 6.75 pounds per 1,000 gallons. All right, so then all we need to do with that is multiply it by our actual application rate, which was, so since this is in pounds per 1,000 gallons, we just multiply it by the 3.65. So 6.75 times 3.65 means we're getting 24.6 pounds of N per acre. So again, for 200 bushel corn, we're going to need to supplement that with some commercial nitrogen if we're going to stick to that P2O5 application rate. And then for our potassium, we just take the 24 pounds per 1,000 gallon that's available there, multiply that by our application rate, and we have 88 pounds of K2O that we're going to put down. Okay, I know that was a lot of math first thing on a Monday morning. I do have a few other examples I can share with you on a PDF if you want to work through those, and then reach out if you have questions, but I think I'm out of time.
Thanks, Amanda. Any questions for Amanda can be put in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to those after all speakers have gone. So thank you, Amanda. And with that, we'll turn it over to Kendall.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for hopping on, and thanks, Amanda, for the introduction and kind of the warm up here. I'll bridge off of what Amanda shared this morning and kind of talk about how we get to know how much nutrients we're putting down on the ground per acre per spreader load, because we're talking about manure spreader calibration this morning. And so I appreciate Amanda. The slides this morning that I'll be sharing come from her, and I appreciate her. As Rachel just shared, if you have any questions or anything like that, we can drop them in the chat or the Q&A features, and we will attend to those as they come in. Why do we need to calibrate our manure spreaders? It seems like a kind of an oddity. It's something that we just need to get rid of, right? We have the manure in the barns or in the stockpile facility or in the pits, and we just need to get rid of it. And so it goes on the ground, and we apply it by load and make sure it goes away till we're done. But it's important that we're calibrating to know the amount of nutrients that we're putting on, as Amanda was just sharing and helping us kind of figure through that math. It really helps us to confirm what rate we're getting on the ground per acre. It also helps us to make more efficient use of those nutrients, helps us to determine the appropriate overlap, make sure we're not overspreading or underspreading at any point during the process. It also allows us to adjust those application rates, as once we have a better idea of what we're putting down, we can know that if we need to change the settings of our equipment, whether our equipment's wearing down and we need to make some adjustments to our speed or the settings on the machine itself to make sure we're getting the accurate rate that we're looking for. And ultimately, all of these things combine to make sure that we are promoting an effective nutrient management plan, especially up here. I'm in Fulton County in the Western Lake Erie Basin, ensuring that we are applying nutrients and manure at their proper rates in the right place, the right time, and the right source. Manure is the right source, but making sure that we have those other three R's captured as part of our nutrient management plan, and that's done through the use of manure spreader calibration. So what kind of information does manure spreader calibration provide? And at the end of the day, we're looking for a result of the amount of manure expressed as an amount of the acreage that we've covered versus the amount of material that we put on that ground or that acreage. And that's usually expressed as tons per acre as for solid product or gallons per acre as a liquid product. As a grower and speaking with growers, working with growers, I think we're often apt to say, well, we applied 20 loads to this field, or we hauled 30 loads today. And loads per field or loads per day is truly not an acceptable rate when it comes to nutrient management plans and overall getting an understanding of what kind of nutrients we're applying when we are spreading manure. And so spreader calibration is going to help us get a little bit more clear as to what we're actually applying as we're doing it. When we conduct a spreader application, it's important that we keep record of a number of different pieces of information, whether that's the overall area that we've covered is going to be pretty critical. The measurement of the amount of manure we applied is going to be important, as well as recording our equipment settings. The speed that we're going down, the RPMs that the machinery is operating at, all of that's going to have an effect on the overall output that our applicators are providing us. It's also important to know that we have a good spread width defined. Again, all of those different tractor settings and implement settings are going to impact the width and the overlaps of our equipment and our spread pattern. And we want to make sure we have that recorded to know if we need to make any adjustments once the calibration is complete. There are a couple different methods we're going to talk about here this morning. The first is the swath or load area method, and then the second is the tarp or weight area method. Both of them have their advantages and both are unique to each other, but both are going to get us an accurate calibration for us to use moving forward. The first one we're going to talk about here is the swath or the load area calibration process. This can be used for both solid and liquid manures. And kind of the five basic steps to calibrating using this method is we first need to determine the capacity of our spreaders. We'll apply a full load, and then we'll need to measure the area and calculate the area of the coverage that we provided after we've spread that full load. And then once we have all those pieces of information, we'll be able to calculate the application rate. Diving into those steps more individually, the first thing that we're going to need to do is to determine the spreader capacity. And the most accurate way to do that is to weigh the manure load. Now, this is kind of where this portion or the most accurate way is maybe a downfall for several because we need to have scales. And I recognize that that's not something that everyone has immediate or close access to. Whether it's a grain scale that we're able to drive the whole machinery on, maybe we have scales on the loader that's filling the implement. Uh, all of those are good options, but scales can be a limiting factor for this spread or load area method. We want to weigh the spreader both empty and loaded to get our net weight. And we want to do this, everything that we do today that I'm going to speak with you about, we want to do on average about 3 times to get a good average because the way that you load the spreader may not be the way that the hired hand loads the spreader or the way that you load the spreader time after time, especially as you get into different manures and different sections of the barn or different sections of the stockpile. The material could change just slightly as well. And so what you consider to be a full load might look different each time. Helping to get some averages is going to make that a little bit clearer process and get you a little bit more defined. There are so many variables that go into spreading manure that it's important that we kind of average them out and try to get the least amount of noise as possible when we're conducting a spreader calibration. Once we get that average load weight, we're going to convert to tons or gallons based off of the particular spreader that you have. I'm going to drop a link here or ask someone to drop a link in the chat for me if you would. I think I can do it here. So that link I just dropped in the chat is going to send you to a PDF of a Penn State fact sheet that is going to walk through all of the calculations that I'm walking through today. So if your pen's not keeping up with me or you want to just make more specific notes, you can do so using that PDF fact sheet. Really good fact sheet that gives all of the formulas and the methods that we're going to be talking about here today. If you don't have access to scales, the other way we can do it is by just measuring the spreader volume. We do that by also using the formulas, and we'll dive into using both of these methods here just a little bit and some examples. Probably the least reliable way that we can use and determine a spreader's capacity is by going off the manufacturer's capacity rating, and we'll go off of why that is in just a moment. Once we get our measurements of our spreader, we can convert our cubic feet into liquid gallons by multiplying by a factor of 7.48, or if we're using solid manure, we can convert to tons by using a textbook multiplying factor of 0.0275. But again, those are textbook values, and it's a little bit better if we would actually get the density of the manure. As we just talked about, the manure density can change in different sections of the barn, different times of the year, different bedding materials, and so getting the actual density of that material is going to help us to get a really accurate spreader capacity. To do that, we'll weigh an empty 5-gallon pail and get the tare weight of that pail, fill it with manure, and then we'll reweigh that 3 or 4 times full of manure to get a good average. And then we can use that average weight and multiply by 1.5 to get our density in pounds per cubic foot. So putting this into practice here, let's say we have a spreader that measures 15 by 8 and we load it 5 feet deep. That's going to give us a volume of 600 cubic feet. And to convert that to solid tons, our liquid or our solid conversion factor, our textbook factor is 0.0275. So according to the textbook, our manure spreader would have a capacity of 16.5 tons. However, we're going to conduct a manure density calculation on the product that we're using, and our average weight we calculated to be 19.5 pounds. We multiply that out to get pounds per cubic foot, and that comes out to 29.25 pounds per cubic foot. If we convert that to tons per cubic foot, we divide that by 2,000 pounds per ton, and we come up with this conversion factor of 0.0146. Now, when we straighten out the math here, we can see that we are actually not applying 16.5 tons, even though that's what the textbook and the manufacturer tag says. We're actually applying 8.8 tons, nearly half of what we thought we were. And so this just goes to show the importance of conducting a manure density test and really getting down to the nitty-gritty and figuring out what a full manure spreader actually weighs and what our full load actually looks like. For liquid, I would argue that liquid manure probably the density of it doesn't change as frequently as the solid manure does. Amanda's first slide this morning showed the differences in percent solids of liquid, and it's a pretty narrow gap. 0 to 5 is liquid manure, up to 10 is 10% slurry. Above 10% to 30, 40, 50 is our solid manure. We have a lot more variability in the density of our solid manure than the liquid. However, our percent solids can still change, and it's important to conduct a density test in liquid materials as well. To do that, we're going to fill a container with a 1 gallon container 5 times to get 5 gallons of material. Mark that level and then fill it with manure. Once we get that manure weight, we will repeat that 3 to 4 times using our gross weight of our bucket, subtract the tare weight, and then we'll be able to calculate the pounds per gallon by taking that average weight minus our tare, divide that by 5 gallons because we're getting an overall sample of 5 gallons in that pail. Then we'll divide that and get our pounds per gallon and our density there. Once we have our density, then we can use the spreader capacity using those formulas that we just shared with to get our pounds per load, or if we know the net weight of that spreader, we can get our gallons per load to get a little bit more accurate to know what our spreader is applying there. Now, once we have our spreader capacity, then we need to calculate our application rate or where, and to do that, we need to calculate the area that we've spread. So we're going to walk through an example here together. We have a liquid manure spreader, round cylindrical tank. It's 20 feet long, 7 feet by 7 feet in diameter, and it has a spread width or spread pattern of 22 feet, and we spread the entire length of the field at 1,300 feet. So the question is, what is the application rate? So let's walk through this together. First, we need to calculate the volume of our spreader here down that you see pictured. And to do that, we need to find the measurement of that cylinder, the volume of a cylinder. Using the formulas from page 2 of that publication that's in the chart, we can come up with 784 cubic feet is the total volume of our spreader. We're just going to use the textbook conversion factor, and for liquid, it's 7.48 gallons per cubic foot, and that gives us a total spreader capacity here of 5,864 gallons. We went out and took the spreader, spread it out till it was empty, and then we measured our swath width, which was 22 feet, and we went the full field length, 1,300 feet, and that gives us a square footage of 28,600 square feet. Use our conversion to get that into acreage, 43,560 square feet in an acre. That gives us 0.66 acres. Follow the math through, and we get an application rate of 8,885 gallons per acre. A lot of math here this morning, but I hope it makes sense and that you are recognizing the different steps that takes place to get a true application rate out of your machine. Now, if you have a drag hose system, you don't have a dedicated capacity or a full per se, because we're pumping manure continuously. We're going to use a very similar method. We need to just calculate the area and the volume, and we'll do that using all of the factors that go into that. Obviously, our tractor speed, the flow rate that's going through the system, and our effective spread width is going to give us the ultimate volume. The area, and then based off the flow rate, we'll get the volume that we needed to calculate our application rate there in gallons per acre. The more hose we add, if our tractor speed changes, if we add a booster pump, subtract a pump, all of those things are going to impact our application rates of a drag hose system. The next method we'll talk about here is the tarp weight area calibration process. This is a little bit more streamlined, I feel personally, because we don't need scales or commercial scales for this. This is a little bit more applicable to any grower, and anyone can conduct a calibration using this method. What you're going to do is you're going to obtain ideally 3 tarps or plastic sheets and get their dimensions. You'll weigh the tarp to get that tare weight of that tarp. We'll place them out in the field, make our manure spreader pass, and then we'll collect it and weigh the material that's been collected on that tarp. Using the table that's provided in that fact sheet or another method I'll share with you in just a moment, you can get your application rate in tons per acre by using this conversion factor of 21.8. So say you got your tarps, you went out and spread them. This is what you look like out there picking up that material, and I'm going to get a weight on that. And so now we're going to try something here. This is our first pass that we've made, and if it works, I'd like to shoot a poll out, and on your screen now is a poll. How many tons per acre do you think this is? We're going to put your eyeballs to the test here. You can guess 40 tons per acre, 33 tons per acre, or 25 tons per acre. Give everybody a chance here, and then if one of our moderators wants to share the answer or pass the answer to me.
If you if you had 33, you'd be correct. I can't get it to show the answer, but 33 was the correct answer.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Amber.
Oh,
So
there we
33 tons per acre here, and we got about 50% right. So a little bit thought more, a little bit thought less, but over half or right at half of you were correct. So congratulations. Next one, we'll keep the eyeballs to the test here. Looking at the white tarp here, what do you think got applied here in tons per acre? Do you think it's 9.2, 13.5, or 7.7? All right. Correct answer here is 9.2 tons per acre. And most of you thought it was less. That's kind of deceiving here. The tarp's a little bit further away, but we'll give you one more shot here. What's your guess here? And the last tarp that we threw out there, is it 9.1, 4.5, or 7.2? All right, we'll keep things moving this morning. 7.2 tons per acre is our answer there. And again, our eyeballs might have deceived us there a little bit heavier. It looks like it's a little bit heavier, but majority of you got it right. So congratulations. Your eyeballs serve you well. So let's say we did those three and just walk through the process of completing a tarp weight analysis and calibration. So we set out our 3 8-foot by 8-foot sheets, each has a 2-pound tare weight. Each of our sheets has the considered weight there, and we're going to figure the application rate. The question is, what is the application rate? So first thing we got to do is calculate our net weight and then get our average. Our average weight on those tarps was 45.3 pounds. Then we need to divide by our square feet to get our pounds per foot squared. 8 by 8 tarp, 64 square feet. Carry the math through, 0.71 pounds per foot squared. And then if we multiply that by our conversion factor of 21.8, which comes from the equation of square feet in an acre divided by 2,000 pounds per ton, we get an application rate of 15.5 tons per acre. Now, this morning, I'm going to offer you a little gift as a cheat code for the tarp weight area method. If you conduct a tarp weight area method and you take your tarps and cut them down to exactly 56 by 56 inches, we can eliminate all of the math because 56 inches by 56 inches is equivalent to 21.78 feet squared. If you divide that by 21.8, you get almost exactly one. And so the amount of pounds that you collect on your material is going to be equivalent to the tons per acre you're applying. No extra math there. And for people like me, that's a great thing. So if you want a little bit of a cheat code, you can cut down your tarps to 56 by 56. And even better yet, if you're looking for your own manure spreader calibration kit, a water quality associate, Heather Torlina, applied for a grant with and partners with NRCS, Soil and Water, and OSU Extension to put together manure spreader calibration kits for you. And each kit is a tarp, a scale, and a worksheet. I have one here. And we can make sure we get these to you. In the spirit of Cyber Monday, we're offering a express sale here. Our water quality associates called me up and they said, we will get you a kit. And for five easy payments of free 99, we'll guarantee you delivery before Christmas even. So how about that? Imagine the face of your children at home on Christmas opening their very own manure spreader calibration kit. I can't imagine anything better. Unfortunately, this is a virtual meeting, and I hope you're laughing, but seriously, if you do need a kit, we have them for you, and we'll be more than glad to get them to you. We can get them to your local county extension office rather quickly here. Putting a bookend on a presentation here this morning, or at least my portion. Other thing that we need to consider when we're conducting a manure spreader calibration is that we need to consider the overlap. We all know that the spread pattern that we're getting on the wings of our machine is certainly not as dense or as thick as that's coming out of the center of the machine. And so calculating that overlap, figuring out the point to where we're getting about half of the material and figuring out at what point we need to turn around and double back on that last pass to get a more equivalent overlap here would be the goal of a spreader calibration. You can do that using the tarp weight method instead of lining those tarps in a line or parallel with the machine. If you line them perpendicular, you can get a better idea of what your overall spread pattern is and what kind of material you're getting out on those wings of the machine rather than that of the center. Once we complete our manure spreader calibration, then we can adjust. We know that if we're spreading too heavy or too thick, or too thin, we can adjust our tractor speed, our spreader settings, our overlap. All of these things can be adjusted to get an accurate calibration and get our application rate exactly where we want it. Question is, how often should you calibrate? And the standard answer is at least annually, though I would argue that you should probably calibrate each spreading season. If you're spreading in the summer, the density of that manure is going to be different than that of the winter, even if you held all things constant, the feed, the bedding material, the number of head, just the amount of liquid that those animals are going to consume is going to change the consistency and the density of that manure. If it's been sitting in the dry stack barn for a month versus the dry stack barn for a year or 6 months, all those things are going to impact. And so when that density of the manure changes, you should be recalibrating your machine. Or when you upgrade or change equipment, that's also another consideration. And then once we have that calibration information, you combine all of that with the information that Amanda just shared earlier this morning with your soil test, your nutrient analysis, your crop plan yield goal, and record keeping to bring it all together to get a good, accurate spread application and calibrated. And with that, that's all the questions I have. I conduct spreader applications for my growers. I'm glad to come out and play in the poop and would strongly encourage you to get your county educator involved. Maybe you want to gift them a spreader application, a calibration kit. Love to get you connected with them if you haven't already made that connection to your local county educator. It's a great resource for you. And if they won't do it, I'll come out and do it myself. But that's all I have for you this morning. Appreciate the time. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I will remain on here if you want to drop them later.
Perfect. Thank you, Kendall. That was super informative and actually hilarious. So we'll turn it over to Eric and we'll wrap up with him. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm trying to find my appropriate share screen, so it's good to see you all. I'm Eric Rieker. a field specialist in farm management, and prior to that, a county educator up in Northwest Ohio. Confirm, Rachel, that you can hear me and see my slide deck.
Yep, looks good. I can hear you good too.
Awesome. Awesome. It's a pleasure to be with you, talking oddly, about manure. So we'll jump right in. Rachel and Amber had asked me to talk a little bit about a research summary from a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant that occurred back in 2021 through 23, and it was on farm. It started when I was still a county educator and before I came into the new role. So it's a great data set that I'd like to share with you. And so it's really a comparative analysis of bedding sources used in pen pack cattle manure. And so it was we tried to stay very tight on what source of manure we used and how we used it. And so I'll kind of walk through that. Was a county educator in Fulton County prior to Kendall. And between about 2016 and 2020, there were nearly 50 dry stack barns built in the county. Of course, post 2014, the Toledo water crisis gave a little bit of incentive to do those things. There's lots of Holstein beef fed in the county. This work was done in Fulton and Henry County. We know that composting, that it allows us to move manure further. We also had some legacy phosphorus fields we were dealing with. And then the whole Western Lake Erie Basin, trying to be as good as we can at managing manure nutrients in what we do. So the goals for this project. So we just I saw Glenn Arnold on a call. Glenn has been a longtime mentor to me. And in COVID, Glenn said, "Hey, there's this grant coming due," and it was about right at the time COVID was hitting. We put it in, and these were our goals for the project, essentially from day one in about early 2020 or mid-year 2020. So our goals for this project was move nutrients further, increase the storage capacity of our dry stack barns, perhaps make a more stable, more nutrient dense biological product that farmers can use, and then evaluate bedding sources. That was kind of in the third year. Right off the get-go in 2021, we did use some compost in corn situations, and eventually in 22 we used some in an on-farm research study, e-field study with soybeans. So the project included 20 large windrows, okay? And so, the difference between on-farm research and university research station research is generally just quantity and commercial scale and size. And so we put over 1,100 tons of fresh manure in windrows, 20 different windrows with different attributes. I'll talk about those attributes. And it was working with 9 producers. So some producers had 2 windrow sites. We doubled back on those, in some cases a second year. And eventually we did 6 agronomic field trials, and I'll share a couple of those later on. So just so you know very clearly the attributes for this research, the manure that was used was almost exclusively Holstein beef manure from what we would call a stage 1 barn. So smaller calves, 250 to 600 pounds, where DDGs, dried distiller grains, and corn byproducts were fed as feedstuff. So generally a fairly hot manure ration, or hot feed ration, producing a hotter manure ration. We had piles that were built inside and outside on a location basis. The 3 bedding sources, sawdust, straw, and corn stalks, each composted differently. And 18 out of 20 of our piles were turned with an HCL turner. I'll show that in a little bit. And then we had some attributes where we talked to the farmer and said, well, do you want to turn weekly or do you want to turn every 2 weeks? And so we kind of tried to establish a standardized protocol using and acknowledging these attributes. Just so that as a listener, it was fairly consistent manure that we were using. So I call this a 6-step process to do this research. First and foremost, like a boxer or a high school wrestler, we weighed the manure in. Okay, so the only way we knew that there were 1,100 tons of raw manure was we asked producers to weigh them in. And so maybe they weighed 1 or 2 spreaders, and then they spun off the spreader in a windrow, and we helped them build a windrow with their telehandler, skid loader. And then I'll turn, hopefully you can see this video. There's no sound to the video, but um, we built these windrows that, just went over top or that would be accommodated by this HCL turner. And this is an example of a pile with quite a bit of sawdust in the mix. But we essentially built these large windrows, 6 foot tall by 12 foot wide by approximately 100 feet long. So commercial windrow piles. We did that in a lot of cases in these manure storage barns. It was COVID, and it was an opportunity to get on farm and do some research. From my perspective, we also used these compost barns because we could really control the weather, or really control the amount of moisture, and kind of standardize the research environment, if you will. Now, about 4 or 5 of them were conducted outside, so I do acknowledge that as well. We turned 9 piles weekly. We turned 9 piles bi-weekly, and 2 of the piles were static, meaning we built them and we blew some air into them in order to get them to cook right there. You have to turn them. You have to add some air because the bacteria need oxygen to survive. Equipment stats or equipment background. HCL is a California compost turner, compost manufacturer, requires 110 PTO horsepower. We were fortunate to work with Redline Equipment up here in Northwest Ohio. They provided a CVT tractor at a very reasonable rate. That CVT, that continuously variable transmission, was crucial because the first pass through, especially on a straw-based compost, required you to move at a snail's pace, like 0.05 miles per hour. That compost turner was more about mixing and grinding than it was aeration. The aeration lasted for about maybe 12 or 24 hours before that bacteria had consumed a lot of that oxygen again, but it was just really good, made a really nice, consistent product. The 4th step in the research was to track temperature. We had 3 day of turn temperature recordings. So kind of with this probe that you see on the left-hand side, and we provided all of our growers with a compost thermometer like that. We also were a little bit more, had a little bit more high tech. We used these hobo temp loggers in 3 spots in these windrows, and they would log the temperature every 10 minutes. Looked a little bit something like this. It had a radio frequency ID, so it could send that data to my cell phone when I drove up within about 100 feet of the pile. So we'd drive up and we could download the data. The deep drops right there are the opposite of a spike. The deep dips in this right-handed side chart is when we remove them. We only ran 1 compost thermometer through the compost turner, but we tried to remove them before running them, but that's where the temperature dropped, okay, and it would pull up on our phone. So ideally trying to keep our temperature or get our temperature between that 120 to 140 kind of temperature range so that composting was right at the right temperature for the bacteria to work. And you can see it would start slowly. We were pulling manure out of the barn that was already 80 to 90 degrees. And once you stacked it, turned it, and added a little bit of air, it really, really heated up quite a bit. It heated up so much that in the winter of 21, maybe one of our last winters that was really, really cold, you could still turn compost and there was a lot of heat in it. The piles just kept working to the point that, snow caps were limited. A lot of that moisture kind of wicked out the top or kind of chimneyed out the top of those windrow piles. You can see that as we're going through a 40-foot wide barn here. The 5th step was manure sampling, and Amanda talked a lot about this. Kendall confirmed it. We sampled very intensely. So every time we turned, so if it was a weekly turn, every week we were pulling 3 samples so that we could do a statistical analysis. 5 numbers we really paid pretty close attention to. So those are in the red boxes. We paid attention to moisture. Okay. Some of our samples would come in at high 60s, maybe even touch 70% moisture. And we tried to work them down to the high 40s in moisture, getting them closer and closer to kind of a poultry litter. Never really quite achieved a poultry litter, moisture, but that was kind of the goal. Our carbon to nitrogen ratio, we wanted to kind of observe, kind of got to that 20-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And then we paid attention to total nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on a pounds per ton basis. And Amanda talked quite a bit about that. So, uh, we won't spend a lot of time other than to say oftentimes the product ended up being a very good a very good potassium product. The last step was for in the first year, especially each of the 6 growers that participated in the first year, they received a cooperator payment if they did a field trial with the compost, comparing the compost to raw manure. You can barely see it on the left-hand side of this screen was the raw manure strip. And this farmer was going through applying kind of this really dark, really rich colored compost in the spring. And so kind of some neat field trials. And I'll show you more of those eventually. We ended up with a kind of an infographic that I think summarizes this research really well. I can have the water quality team send this handout to you as after the session is over here. But it kind of it shows exactly what we did on the 20 compost piles or what the data showed. So anything that was in red up on this top chart was where we started with the raw manure, and the gray was where we ended. I'll come back to that. I'm going to kind of break this all apart for you, at least the top two. But the big takeaways for farmers was, they had almost a 30% reduction in overall loads. So as a farmer, a livestock farmer, your goal is to reduce your loads going down the road, whether that's in a dump box or whether that's in a spreader. And when we looked at the weight, we went from 1,164 tons down to 727. So there's significant weight loss. Much of that we acknowledge was moisture, but some of that we believe was kind of this transformation of unusable phosphorus and nitrogen into more usable, stable nitrogen. And then finally, this is a picture of Fulton County, the shape of Fulton County. On average, the compost was carried 3.8 miles from the barn to field. So just a little bit further than maybe a grower would, depending on the size of grower, a little bit further than grandpa carried the manure and perhaps dad carried the manure, but distances that we're going to have to carry manure into the future to distribute that manure from barn to field. This is the very deep summary, zoomed in. I put this up in the corner, the moisture. The fresh manure came in on average. So in the 20 piles, we would sample the fresh manure, took 3 samples on the day we built the windrow. On average, those 60-some samples average 67% moisture. In the finished product on week 8, generally, we're at about 48% moisture. And when you go back and do the weight reduction and the tonnage from start to ending, we reduced the weight by about 48%. Looking at nutrients, there's not a lot of change in the nitrogen, arguably. It takes a lot of nitrogen to convert the carbon. The carbon kind of binds to a lot of the nitrogen, ties it up, if you will, and produces a really nice organic nitrogen, but just not as much as we would kind of like coming out of this process. The real story here is that phosphorus nutrient concentration more than doubled, potassium doubled, sulfur quintupled. Is that the right word? It's almost a 5x rate on our sulfur. Calcium was a 4 times the original. And so I think when you look at these last 4 nutrients, PK, sulfur, and calcium, that's a pretty telling story of what composting can do if you compost it, but then also if you distribute that well. So Kendall talked about the right rates. I think when you carry this compost to the right field that needs sulfur and calcium, potassium, you're doing yourself a service as a farmer. Again, both Kendall and Amanda talked about soil sampling or manure testing, excuse me. So over the whole course of the 3 years and the 20 sites, 20 windrows, we had 362 total manure samples. That's what a lot of the grant was used for. But we had 20 piles where when we built a pile on day one, we sampled 3 times. So that's how you get 20 times 3 samples. We had 60 samples from fresh manure that averaged a 13, 9, 14. Okay. On the day we scaled out, we had 19 piles. One of them, we tried to mix some gypsum in, wildly distorted sulfur and calcium. And so I threw that data point out. So this is an average of the 19 piles that went out. So a 16, 25, 30 with a slug of sulfur and a slug of calcium per ton. Feel really confident about that data when you have a sample size of, 60, 57 to 60. So let's pivot to the bedding sources. This was not, I will say we didn't really go into the research thinking about evaluating bedding sources, but when you talk to farmers and commercial livestock managers, it's really interesting that the questions they bring up and it helps make your research better, or at least I feel like it's helped make the research better. So we got down to the point where we realized we were comparing a lot of straw manure versus sawdust manure. And that kind of depends on the beef integrator, what they're willing to pay for and what they're willing to bring and what stage the calves are. Certainly sawdust is used in situations where there's a concern about respiratory things, respiratory health issues with your cattle. But to start off with, if you look at the book values of carbon to nitrogen ratios, the wheat straw is 80 to 1, sawdust, wood chips are 400 to 1, and corn stover is 57 to 1. So certainly different carbon and nitrogen ratios, and this is going to play out when we evaluate the bedding sources to a small degree. We had 27 samples or 9 piles that were 9 windrows that were out of straw, 7 piles times 3 samples at the start and end. That's where I got my sample size of 21. They ended up 7 windrows of purely sawdust, and then we had 2 piles that were purely corn stalks. And so you can see this information there's very little difference in the nitrogen in these 2 products, our most popular 2 bedding sources. But there's quite a bit of difference, and we do need more samples, I will admit, on the corn stalks, but the nitrogen on the corn stalks was substantially better. When you compare the phosphorus and the potassium, that concentration that's in the sawdust bedding source. Sawdust is just a little bit lower in all categories, with the exception of this nitrogen when compared to straw. When you compare the NP and K in corn stalks, as you would guess, if you have a really, if you remove a 250 bushel corn crop, you're removing a lot of potassium and phosphorus stover. And so that makes a lot of sense that when we bale this up, we're exporting a lot of that. When we add some cattle manure to it and compost it for 6 or 8 weeks, we just make an extremely good manure product, a 36, 44, 56 product. Far and away, the best composted manure or the best manure product coming out of the cattle barns was that made in 8 weeks out of corn stalk bales. This is the chart of the data, and so maybe for some of you it's easier to look at it this way when they're stacked on top of each other. The carbon to nitrogen ratio, the total nitrogen, the phosphorus difference, and then a potassium difference. To me, that's very telling information. We do know that straw and sawdust are still more popular. Just they absorb a little bit better. I'll get into that here in this slide. Actually, I'm gonna try and back up and type into chat, if you will, which of these, your opinion. I should have done this before we got this far, but which of these do you think would be better for, if you interview cattle guys, which of these is a better product for the calves? Corn stalks, straw, or sawdust? Not sure how much participation we'll get, but give you a few seconds. So in kind of year 3, late 22 and early 23, we started asking growers just a little bit about this. Okay. I have my screen kind of wonky right now. I can't see I can't see the chat, but I'll just keep moving forward. Oh, here they are. Just let me see what the folks say. Some said straw dust, straw. Yeah. So when you talk with cattle integrators, one of their biggest concerns is that calf respiratory health. And so when you look at these three products, which is better for calves, generally speaking, in those stage ones, those early calves, the 250s to 5, 6, 700 pounds, keeping those calves dry it just is paramount. And so you're going to see a lot of cattle integrators favor this sawdust if they can source it for a reasonable price. It does a better job of urine absorption. It is more expensive. It does compost very well. We kind of made some comparisons, which one composts the best. And the corn stalks surprisingly had impressive temperatures and good air movement. And we attribute that to the chunks of corn stalks that allow for more oxygen to be in that windrow pile. They inherently allow for more oxygen movement. The nutrient density, that's probably where sawdust loses out, okay? Versus the corn stalks was, in our opinion, the best nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium combination. It was very close, I would say, between straw and corn stalks. Both the straw and the corn stalks had very good potassium levels, and I think that's an important nutrient to pay attention to. So subjective analysis of the spreadability. The best spreading compost was sawdust, but all three sources spread better than raw manure out of the barn, just because they were heated up and kind of broken down for 8 weeks before they went out the barn. Just a second. There was another question, is 8 weeks enough? So we evaluated the data, those that were composted for less than 8 weeks and those that were composted for more than 8 weeks. I wouldn't say 8 weeks was anything magic. Aside from when we first started doing this research, we asked cattle integrators with larger manure barns if we could use some of their space to do this research and kind of engage them. And when working with cattle integrators, time and space and manure handling is premium. And so 8 weeks was about the most that a lot of them wanted to commit to us. So we had 9 piles that were turned for less, or that were in compost less than 56 days, and 10 that were over that. When you look at this data, the answer is that anything that's composted a little bit longer had a little higher concentration of P, sulfur, and calcium. A little bit on the nitrogen side. We don't know why that is, but that's just what our sample showed. But it inherently has a higher concentration of phosphorus, sulfur, and calcium. All that to say, I'm not sure it's necessary to compost much longer than 8 weeks if you're in that tight a situation. If you have a static pile, absolutely, you have to let it set just a little bit longer because the amount of oxygen is limited unless you put some air into the floor. Certainly carbon is carbon, the advantages of carbon, building carbon, storing carbon is a conversation that's around and among us. So we just kind of meta-analyzed some of the samples that we had looking for organic carbon. So the manure samples that we took always reported organic carbon and also first year availability of nitrogen. When you look at fresh manure, it frankly wins the organic carbon source of carbon and an opportunity to store carbon in soil. So if we're putting that carbon on a field, we're covering it up, we're getting it in the ground for plants to use. Really good carbon story there at this 10 ton per acre rate. We had 24 samples there. We also had 24 samples at a composted rate. Still a very high level of organic carbon, a little less nitrogen available here. And I'll reference this slide again eventually because the nitrogen quantity is just better in raw manure than it is in compost. And so that's the trade-off. We also, in that same year, we had an opportunity to take some cover crop wheat biomass, cover crop red clover, and alfalfa biomass at first cutting. And so when you make comparisons of what I'll call the manure carbon story and the cover crop carbon story, this data would suggest that the carbon story associated with manure is perhaps several degrees, several magnitudes more valuable than cover crop. And when you put those two together, we didn't have situations where we overlapped these. We just pulled some samples in cover crop situations. But when you overlap them, you got a tremendous carbon story about what that soil is doing from a carbon storage and a carbon production perspective and producing that cover crop biomass, but also storing the manure or the compost carbon. So I'll kind of wrap up on the agronomic field trials, the last few minutes here. In 2021, if you're familiar with Ohio State's eFields program, we had 3 or 4 trials in the 2021 eFields trial where we asked each of these growers. This was one grower in the county who had a 0 starter check. The lighter was about 6 or 8 tons of raw manure, and then half of that in this compost situation. We had another grower that just did the lighter color over here is the raw manure at 10 tons, and the darker color is the compost at 5 tons per acre. And so that's kind of what we asked them to do, is set up a side-by-side. These were spaced at about a 40-foot swath, and then we put flags in the center of these to ensure that the 8 rows that the farmer was harvesting was in fact over top of those strips. Manure research is it's a debate if it's science or if it's an art, but it's a combination of both. And so working with growers to get their equipment dialed in and spread on an auto steer line, I think was pretty important to getting this done. So generally speaking, we asked producers to put on 10 tons of their fresh manure coming out of the barn and then compare it with 5 tons of the composted manure. Worked pretty good because it allowed about 8 weeks for that grower to build up raw manure in their barn while the compost was being composted. And then we went out and kind of applied this, or we applied a half rate versus a full rate of fresh manure, half rate of compost, full rate of fresh manure. And what that ended up being when you did the math, it ended up being a very similar, again, a little bit of art in manure research, but it ended up being a potassium trial. So we were kind of comparing phosphorus sources, potassium sources in compost, potassium sources in manure. And so we know that this 130 pounds per acre of nitrogen did throw off our research. And so it's not perfect work, but it gave us something to talk about. And so one of our trials in that 2021 eFields booklet was comparing I called it the tri-state fertility recommendations using manure, compost, or commercial fertilizer. So we compared 5 tons of compost, 10 tons of poultry or 10 tons of raw manure, and then a two-year tri-state fertility rate. And so clipped right out of the 2021 eFields booklet, we used tri-state fertility that matched what this farm needed: 200 pounds of potash, 100 pounds of MAP, 50 pounds of AMS to get a little bit of sulfur. And that yielded 190. We put 10 tons per acre of manure on and 5 tons per acre of compost. And so thanks, Rachel, for directing them to where it was in 2021. But for those of you who understand our statistical analysis, any treatment that has a yield with the same letter in it, so these both have A in them, so we would say that the manure versus the compost had no statistical difference in yield, because the least significant difference was almost 15 bushels. So again, manure research, not perfect science. It can sometimes be a little bit noisy. So we would say the manure yielded the same as the compost, or the compost yielded the same as the manure. Now, you'll notice that two of them have a B in them. And so when I circle the tri-state fertilizer at 190 bushels per acre versus the compost, both of them have a B in them. We would say there was not more than 14.9 bushels difference between them. So statistically speaking, those two treatments yielded the same bushels of corn. So this was in the 2021 trial, 2021 eFields booklet. And again, I would argue that this is kind of a potassium source trial. We were making sure we had 200 pounds of potash, effectively a 2-year crop rotation, corn and beans of potash versus the manure equivalents. Again, not perfect, but was informative for this farmer in this on-farm research trial. In that same situation, the following year in 2022, we held the swaths on GPS, and so we wanted to know what was the soybean grain, what did it yield? And so when we compared those same treatments, again, I'll go back to the last, it's same setup, tri-state on top, manure, compost. Okay. The manure and compost we're at a clear advantage on soybeans. And so in this farm in this year, there was no statistical difference in these two trials, essentially 55 bushel soybeans versus a tri-state fertility, which yielded 47 bushels per acre. We can break that down 16 ways and argue about what drove that difference. Certainly there was some moisture and some organic matter in the manure and compost. We did not measure the amount of biological activity. We didn't have a cost-effective test to do that, but one could argue that maybe there was some biology that played into it. The long and short of the story is when you put those 2-year studies that were overlaid on top of each other, there's a pretty good advantage to having manure in the system, which livestock farmers have known for a long, long time. I'll end up, that's the agronomic studies, but some of this working with those 9 producers, brought about some really interesting creativity. And I think that's what I most value about working with farmers is they came up with as many ideas as I did. And so we had a producer who said, "Hey, I'm going to build a static pile." And I said, "That's awesome. We need a static pile example." And so he ran some sewer pipe, some leach field pipe in 3 different spots there. Let me jump ahead. He had a little squirrel cage fan. Just a minute. Let me back up. So off to this left side, you can't see the squirrel cage fan, but he had a squirrel cage fan on a timer where it would run 10 minutes and sit for 20 minutes, run 10 minutes and sit for 20. And so really ingenuitive. That ended up making a really nice manure product, compost product. The same farmer also took a radiator with a little bit of a fan and some ambient air temperature comparisons and heated his shop. In a shop in a situation that felt like 2 degrees. You can't read it, but his shop was 64 degrees because he was heating up the air that he then had water pipe. Sorry, there was PEX water pipe in this pile that then came through and ran through the water heater, and he heated his shop. It was pretty interesting. When they pulled those static piles out, it was a little bit tricky. I think this grower eventually, this is maybe my model grower, but eventually that grower said, "Hey, I'm going to propose to NRCS a barn that has trench drains in the floor, and I'm going to blow air in through the bottom." And so they actually built got a barn approved through NRCS that was considered a composting barn. And so that's one of the neat things about some of this research is that it leads farmers to try creative things on their own. They're still composting in that barn now. That was 3-4 years ago, but pretty awesome. So in summary, composting cattle manure doubled or in some cases tripled the density of key nutrients, PK, sulfur, and calcium. We did lose nitrogen. We acknowledge that we lose nitrogen through the composting process. We perhaps make more friendly organic carbon as a result. But some folks, that'll be a moral dilemma giving up that much nitrogen for organic carbon. We reduced the weight by 48%. We reduced the loads by 29%. We increased the travel distance for the 9 growers that participated. When you look at the bedding sources, the nutrient value favors corn stalks over straw, over sawdust. But that's not acknowledging what the cattle integrator needs for calf health. And then finally, manure and compost. In our trial, 1 year of trial in one situation, did just a little bit better than fertilizer and corn and soybean 2-year rotation. So that's what I have for you. Oh, if many of the organic growers also, just a quick plug that I also coordinate the Organic Grains Conference. It's coming up. I'll leave it in the screen, but I do that. I bring that up because all organic growers are using organic nutrient sources like manure, and so perhaps some of you may take interest in it. That's January 7th and 8th. I can drop that in the chat, but overall, very fun working with livestock producers who handle a lot of manure and try and get that manure back out on the appropriate field. Thanks to Great Lakes Commission, who sponsored this research. So thanks.
I did have a question for Amanda here while we wait. Amanda, what happens if someone does the process of manure testing, they get their results back from the laboratory, and the units of measurement are not what they're used to dealing with or not what they're looking for?
Yeah, that happens sometimes, or you don't quite understand what's going on with your manure test. It's perfectly fine to call the lab back and ask them to convert it to something else. I've done that myself, and they're usually pretty good and quick about it. You could also reach out to your local extension educator or one of the water quality associates and ask them for help interpreting that as well.
Yep, great point there. Just looking at some messages here in the chat. Kendall, when you're calibrating a manure spreader, let's say I'm a producer, I've never done it before, and I'm looking to do it. What is the most common mistake that's made that I could avoid?
Great question, Rachel. Most common mistake, just setting up for using the tarp weight method, for example, setting up your tarps or setting up in an area where you're not going at full speed or not going at I think like if we're doing a test, sometimes we throw off, we don't do things as we normally would do them. We don't load the spreader as full, or we don't drive as fast as we normally would. And so it's very important that we hold all things constant. It shouldn't, even though we're doing a test, a calibration, we shouldn't be operating the equipment any differently than we would from a normal operation, because any small change that we might make, whether it's RPMs, tractor speed, any type of machinery setting, all that can throw us off in the long run.
Okay, so basically forget about the fact that I am about to run over a tarp and doing all that stuff. Okay.
Correct. Yep.
Perfect. Eric, one thing that I was thinking about while you were presenting, what type of space constraints are there when it comes to composting manure? Could it be done outside for someone who doesn't have the barn space?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, for what I'll call this compost research, our goal was to try and standardize the environment as much as possible. And so in those larger dry stack barns that we were able to do that, But I would have to go back and look at the data, but three or four piles were done outside. And the answer is you can absolutely do it outside. One of the concerns, at least wise with our compost turner, was it's heavy. It had some narrow tires, and if the ground thawed and we were going through in the middle of winter, in a kind of a bare ground situation, there was concern about mud. I think if you had a stone lot, if you had something where there was a very firm base and you could drive along the stone, or on the stone and make sure that compost turner stayed on the surface, that would be a different situation. But certainly doing it outside is okay. Actually, adding water is okay, because what we found is early on those piles would seep. In the concrete, it would just bubble up. It would stay on the surface of the concrete. We'd often squeegee some of that, I'll say that the leachate back to the pile. You have less of that in an outdoor situation, so you do need to count on rainfall or snow to add some moisture over time.
Okay. And also, I think all three of you at one point or another mentioned the tri-state recommendations. So I'll throw this one to Amanda. Where can we find those?
That's a great question. I put a link in the chat. It is a free downloadable PDF there. So no excuse not to have one handy on your computer. If you do want a hard copy, I think they run $15 online, maybe a little bit less if you get one from a county extension office.
Perfect. It doesn't look like we've had any questions come in from our audience, so we'll go ahead and forward to the CCA credits slide. But some reminders coming up, our first Water Quality Wednesday webinar of 2026 will be on January 28th. You can register for that at go.osu.edu/WQW26. We will put that in the chat. And then our next CLM webinar, which will be the first one in 2026, will be held on February 2nd here in the same time slot. And a reminder again, you'll need to register for that entire 2026 series since this one has ended. Any of our handouts or links that were included in today's webinar will be included in the follow-up email along with the recording of today's webinar. And I also wanted to mention we got a note from Luke Dole that ODA DLEP has workbooks that are designed to automatically calculate nutrients applied by field or source. Some of those are more detailed than others, but they can be helpful, especially with those available nitrogen calculations. So if you're looking for that, you can email Luke Dole, and I'll put his email here in the chat box as well. And again, our team hosts all of these webinars. If you're interested in getting in touch with us, you can email our team at waterqualityassociates@osu.edu or visit our website, waterqualityextension.osu.edu. And this webinar, along with all of our other webinars and other super helpful information, will be posted on the OSU Agronomy YouTube channel. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our presenters for the wonderful job they've done today.